During the final years of the Third Reich, as defeat loomed and despair gripped its leaders, Hitler authorized the development of secret weapons in the hope of turning the tide of the war. Guided missiles, composite bombers, revolutionary fighters, supercannons and chemical agents were all part of a frantic race to design miracle weapons that together made up the dark and ambitious world of the Wunderwaffen, the weapons of doomsday. This is the story of those extreme creations, their men, their failures, and their legacy. Hitler's V3 guns, the Hochdruckpumpe. In 1942, amid the Third Reich's growing desperation to reverse the course of the war, August Coenders presented Adolf Hitler with an unprecedented project. A supercannon capable of bombing London from French territory without the need for rockets, aircraft, or mobile artillery. The idea captured the imagination of the Führer, obsessed with retaliatory weapons, and was soon sponsored as part of the Wunderwaffen program, the so-called miracle weapons. Named V3, this third Vergeltungswaffe had neither the immediate destructive capability of the V1 flying bombs nor the technical sophistication of the V2 rockets. But its design promised a constant and devastating strike on the British capital by means of a unique technology. A multiple-charge cannon that propelled projectiles at extremely high speed with a sequence of controlled explosions along a gigantic tube. The technical principle of the V3 was not new, but it was bold. It was a staged acceleration system, in which a first charge of gunpowder launched the projectile down the barrel, and dozens of secondary charges, distributed in lateral branches along the tube, were successively ignited by a timed electrical system. Each of these explosions added momentum without the projectile leaving the tube, thus increasing its velocity without reaching destructive pressures inside the barrel. This method had been explored theoretically in the late 19th century by American inventors, but had never been built on a functional scale. In its German version, it was intended to reach velocities in excess of 1,500 meters per second, which would allow a 140-kilogram grenade to be launched more than 150 kilometers away. For such a weapon, the engineers needed a fixed, protected, and perfectly oriented installation. In 1943, work began in northern France, on a chalk hill near Mimoyex in the Pas-de-Calais, just over 100 miles from London. The site was chosen for its proximity to the target and for the geology favorable to deep tunneling. 2 parallel subway complexes were excavated, each with 5 inclined galleries that were to house 5 guns each. The structure included a central rail tunnel, storage galleries, firing chambers, electrical installations, ventilation, interior tracks, and ammunition depots. The depth was to exceed 100 meters, and the length of each cannon was to exceed 120 meters. The ambition of the project was colossal. Each battery could fire dozens of shells per hour, keeping a constant rain over central London, especially over Westminster and the Thames bridges. The construction of the subway fortress of Mimoyex progressed under brutal conditions. Thousands of workers were mobilized, among them German technicians, civil engineers from the Ruhr, French forced laborers and Soviet prisoners brought in from the camps. The siege became a nightmare of dust, controlled detonations, disease, and cave-ins. The logistics were extremely complex. The shells were mass-produced and had to be transported by train to the bowels of the bunker, where they were assembled and placed in position. Each piece of the cannon was built in modules, aligned with millimeter precision, and the secondary charges had to be set off in perfect sequence, or the projectile would be deflected or explode inside the tube. As work progressed, however, engineers began to discover difficulties they had not anticipated. The ballistic behavior of the projectile was unstable at such high velocities. Internal friction affected accuracy, the timing of the charges failed in the tests, and the terrain, although favorable, suffered partial collapses in some sectors. Despite these complications, Hitler remained steadfast in his support for the project. He believed that the V-3 would be the ultimate weapon to break British resistance, and that once operational, it would bring psychological pressure as great as that of rocket bombing. Meanwhile, the Allies watched with growing concern the excavations in the Pas-de-Calais. Aerial photos revealed unusual activity, although it was not obvious what type of weapon it was. Initially, it was believed to be new V-2 rocket platforms. It was not until March 1944 that analysts began to suspect a fixed artillery system. However, Allied intelligence still did not understand the scale of the project. In parallel, the bombing began. The RAF and USAAF repeatedly attacked the Mimoyex area with conventional bombs without succeeding in stopping the subway works. But the situation changed in July 1944. On the 6th of that month, the famous 617 Squadron of the RAF, known as the Dam Busters, launched its most accurate attack using the new Tallboy bombs, weighing more than 5 tons, designed to penetrate deep bunkers. One of these bombs hit one of the main galleries directly, collapsing the tunnel and killing dozens of workers. Others destroyed rail accesses, ventilation inlets, and technical chambers. The damage was so severe that the continuation of the project was in doubt. Hitler ordered to continue with at least one cannon, but engineers recognized that the structure was too compromised. As the Allies advanced through Normandy, the V-3's priority was diluted. The Mimoyex fortress was abandoned in August, and Canadian troops captured the site intact in early September. However, the Germans did not abandon the project altogether. They built scaled-down versions of the gun with shorter range and installed them in Luxembourg, where they were used between December 1944 and February 1945 to bombard Luxembourg City with some 180 shells. Although some hit inhabited areas, the damage was minimal and the accuracy completely unsatisfactory. The history of the V-3 was also that of a technical promise that exceeded the capacity of Nazi industry in the middle of the war. Despite the enormous resources invested, the weapon never reached its full performance. Accuracy problems, manufacturing difficulties, infrastructure collapse, Allied bombing, and the advance of the Western Front made its implementation unfeasible. Actual tests showed that the projectiles were unstable at velocities in excess of 1,100 meters per second, far below what was needed. The expected rate of fire of 10 rounds per minute was also not achieved. Of the projectiles produced, more than 20% had serious assembly defects or deformations. Technically, the idea was revolutionary, but the system of multiple side charges required absolute synchronization, which could not be achieved with the electronic and mechanical means available in 1944. The Mimoyex site, after the war, was partially destroyed by the British to prevent its reuse in an operation carried out without the consent of the French authorities, which caused diplomatic tensions. For years, the site was abandoned until it was used as a mushroom farm and finally converted into a museum. Today, part of the tunnels can be toured, and a replica of the cannon is on display along with memorials dedicated to the forced laborers and pilots who participated in its destruction. The figure of Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., brother of the future President of the United States, killed in an airborne operation to destroy similar facilities, is also remembered at the site. The flying wing that would bring the Nazi nuclear age to the year 2000. Among the so-called Wunderwaffen weapons was one that seemed straight out of a futuristic fable, a flying wing fighter bomber without fuselage or tail, powered by jet engines built of composite materials and designed to fly so fast that it could evade any Allied defenses. Its name was Horten Ho 229, and it promised to change the course of the war. Its shape, dark and sharp, evoked the flight of a bat. Its aerodynamic design with no vertical surfaces made it difficult to detect by the rudimentary radars of the time. And most importantly, it was fast, very fast. Capable of exceeding 950 kilometers per hour, it was proposed as an attack and air superiority aircraft with the potential to surpass even the famous Messerschmitt Me-262. It was not just another prototype, but one of the most ambitious bets of the Nazi armament program. For Hitler, who for years had been personally involved in the most exotic military projects, the Ho-229 was not simply a technological curiosity, but one of the keys to reversing Allied superiority in the air. The origin of this aircraft can be traced back to the brothers Reimar and Walter Horten, two young German aviation pioneers convinced that the future lay in the design of the flying wing, a structure that eliminated the need for a traditional fuselage and was inspired by the purest forms of natural flight. Since the 1930s, the Hortens had been experimenting with tailless gliders, tailless models that defied conventional stability principles. Their obsession was to achieve a more efficient, lighter and faster aircraft capable of reducing aerodynamic drag as much as possible. For years, his ideas were marginal, barely tolerated by the German aeronautical authorities, but the war, with its voracious demand for innovation, brought them to center stage. In 1943, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, issued a call for proposals to develop an aircraft that would meet the so-called 3000 requirement. It had to fly at 1,000 kilometers per hour, have a range of 1,000 kilometers, and carry a load of 1,000 kilograms. It was an unconscionable demand for the time, but it fit the Horten vision. Thus was born the Horten H9, later known as Ho-229. The first prototype, the V1, was a glider without engines, conceived to test the aerodynamic stability of the design. Its initial flight in March 1944 proved that the concept was viable. The second prototype, the V2, already had two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojets, the same ones used in the Me-262, mounted in nacelles integrated into the wing structure. This integration not only improved overall aerodynamics, but also contributed to stealth, as there were no prominent vertical surfaces to reflect radar waves. It was a radical design. The entire control structure was concentrated in elevons, combining aileron and stabilizer functions. The aerodynamic brakes were located at the wingtips, where their opening generated enough drag to change course without the need for a vertical rudder. In theory, this made the Ho-229 the first tactical aircraft with stealth characteristics. In the powered flight of the Ho-229 Phi-2 on February 2, 1945, speeds approaching 800 kilometers per hour were reached. But the trials were short-lived. During the third flight, one of the engines caught fire and the plane crashed, killing test pilot Erwin Ziller. The accident did not dampen the enthusiasm of the High Command. A third version, the Ho-229 Phi-3, was ordered to be built, with structural improvements and planned to be the base production model. The plans were ambitious: a night fighter version with radar, a light bomber version, a reconnaissance version, and even a strategic evolution to attack targets as far away as the east coast of the United States were contemplated. For Hitler, the Ho-229 represented a strategic opportunity. The Luftwaffe had lost the air initiative, and German skies were permanently patrolled by Allied fighters and bombers. Raids on Berlin, Hamburg, or Dresden were carried out with impunity. An aircraft so fast that it could intercept formations at high altitude and at the same time so stealthy that British radar could barely detect it, offered a possibility of asymmetrical defense. It was no longer a question of outnumbering the Allies, but of gaining a decisive technological advantage. In this context, the Ho-229 became one of Hitler's personal superweapons. His interest was so strong that he intervened in technical decisions, promoted the financing of the project, and ordered its inclusion in the Jäger program emergency fighter program, which sought to accelerate the delivery of experimental models before the final collapse. But like so many other wonders promised by the Third Reich, the Ho 229 arrived too late. The V-3 was not completed before the fall of Germany. It was captured by General Patton's troops at Gotha, along with other remnants of the program. As part of Operation Paperclip, the Americans moved it to the United States, where it was studied during the Cold War. Its shape aroused great interest. For decades, there was speculation that the Horten had applied a layer of charcoal to the wood coating to absorb radar waves. Although modern tests have not confirmed this, it was verified that the profile of the Ho 229, because of its clean wing design and lack of vertical surfaces, reflected a significantly lower radar signature than other contemporary fighters. In fact, in tests conducted by Northrop Grumman in 2008 with a full-scale replica of the Ho 229 V-3, it was estimated that the aircraft would have had 20% less radar detection than a fighter such as the Bf-109. Despite its apparent potential, not everything about the Ho 229 was perfect. Its pressed wood structure suffered stresses from the heat generated by the jet engines. Flight controls were complex and, according to some reports, unstable at high speeds. In addition, the intended armament, two Mk-108 30mm guns, was not superior to that of Allied fighters, and the lack of an efficient targeting system limited its actual combat effectiveness. It was, in many respects, a device ahead of its time, but incomplete. A brilliant concept that had not been fully worked out. SS biological and chemical weapons. In the years following the conflict, historians and military analysts have wondered why Hitler, whose regime showed no moral qualms about the application of systematic terror, decided to refrain from using these arsenals. The question is even more disturbing when one considers the volume of substances produced, the sophistication of certain agents discovered by German scientists, and the logistics that had been developed for their possible use. In 1936, a team at the IG Farben laboratory in Leverkusen accidentally discovered a compound that would change the paradigm of chemical weapons, Tabun GA, the first in a series of never-before-seen nerve agents. The following year, chemist Gerhard Schrader synthesized Sarin GB, and in 1944, his team obtained Soman GD. These substances did not belong to the family of gases used during World War I, such as chlorine or phosgene, but were organophosphorus compounds capable of destroying the nervous system in a matter of minutes. They were colorless, almost invisible, and even in minute doses could quickly paralyze and kill their victims. No army in the world had comparable weapons at the time. Germany produced tens of thousands of tons of these substances, built specialized plants such as Dihernfurth in Silesia for the industrial production of tabun, and stored the agents in artillery shells and aerial bombs. Subway shelters were built to ensure their preservation, and aerial dispersal methods were tested. However, these compounds were never used in combat, even when the situation in the Third Reich became desperate. This paradox has given rise to multiple hypotheses. One of the most frequently cited suggests that Hitler, himself the victim of a mustard gas attack during World War I, had a psychological dislike of the use of chemical weaponry. Others point to fear of an equivalent retaliation by the Allies, who also possessed large stocks of mustard gas and phosgene. The use of biological weapons was even more clandestine but equally disturbing. The Abteilung Forschung, a secret division of the SS, conducted research on germ warfare, including the use of anthrax, bubonic plague, typhus, and cholera. Some experiments were conducted in concentration camps such as Buchenwald and Dachau, where prisoners were deliberately infected in order to observe the evolution of diseases and to evaluate the efficacy of vaccines or antidotes. These practices, in addition to constituting war crimes, reflect the intention to develop systematic knowledge about the offensive potential of certain pathogens. The Reichsuniversität Straßburg, established by the Nazis in occupied Alsace, was another focus of covert biological studies. Tests with natural toxins, viruses, and poisons were conducted under the guise of medical research. The SS was particularly interested in developing methods to poison water sources in enemy areas or to contaminate foodstuffs distributed to Allied troops. Although there is no conclusive evidence that such operations were carried out systematically, the plans and experiments existed and were discussed at high levels of the military and political apparatus. In parallel, the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, contemplated for years the possibility of covert biological weapons operations. Techniques for spreading anthrax spores in agricultural areas to destroy crops were studied, and schemes were devised to introduce diseases into Britain's livestock through infiltration agents. The reality is that the Nazis had a vast network of scientists, chemists, and physicians willing to explore the limits of biological warfare without ethical restraint. Despite all this infrastructure, production and research, chemical and biological weapons remained without operational use. Some documents revealed after the war suggest that the German High Command doubted the actual tactical effectiveness of these weapons under mobile warfare conditions. On the Eastern Front, where fighting was rapid, disorderly, and extensive, the risks of self-contamination or out-of-control spread were too high. In addition, Russian winter winds could blow the gas back toward the lines themselves. In turn, the possibility that the Allies would respond with their own chemical arsenal, which included large stockpiles stored in Italy, and the United Kingdom made any initial attack a suicide gamble. There were, however, instances in which the use of these weapons came perilously close. In 1943, during the fighting in North Africa, Marshal Rommel requested authorization to use mustard gas against British forces, claiming he could not stop an offensive without it. Hitler refused. In 1945, when the Soviets were already crossing the Oder, some SS commanders proposed using nerve agents in urban areas as a measure of last resort. The idea was discarded for fear of unchecked devastation on German territory. To find out the effects on people, the method was simple. In Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and especially in Natzweiler, Struthof, prisoners were exposed to gases such as phosgene, chlorine, and the well-known iperite, or mustard gas. The method was simple and cruel. Naked subjects were placed in airtight chambers, the chemical agent was released, and then the effects were observed and documented without treatment. The injuries were devastating. Mustard gas, a blistering agent, caused internal and external burns, blisters that oozed for days, blindness, progressive respiratory failure, and, in many cases, slow death by asphyxiation or systemic collapse. The records detailed the time it took for the prisoner to fall, to stop screaming, to convulse. It was a study in agony. At Buchenwald, later reports revealed that experimental combinations of tear gas with neurotoxins were tested on Soviet and Polish prisoners, considered by the doctors as surplus human material. Doses of sarin gas and tabun, the new nerve agents developed in secret by IG Farben and the German military, were also administered, especially in facilities such as Spandau and Die Herrenfurth, where tabun was produced on an industrial scale. Victims had the gas forced into their eyes, applied to their skin, or even injected in liquid form. The effects were atrocious. Violent muscular contractions, uncontrollable vomiting, foaming at the mouth, respiratory arrest. In some cases, they were tied up to prevent movement and observe the complete clinical course of the intoxication until death. those responsible for these tests were not only SS doctors. Several renowned scientists with doctorates and previous university careers were actively involved. Under the pretext of military research, they justified torture as a method of obtaining data. They meticulously documented the evolution of injuries, the resistance of the human body to varying doses, the cumulative effects. Prisoners were not treated as human beings, but as carriers of physiological variables. Some were subjected to multiple exposures. They were cured just enough to repeat the test weeks later. When they were no longer useful, they were executed or left to die without assistance. At the conclusion of the war, the Tabun and Sarin stockpiles were discovered by the Allies. Their compositions were intensively studied and laid the foundation for the subsequent development of modern chemical weapons during the Cold War. Scientists involved in their development were captured or recruited by the Soviets and Americans as part of the Third Reich's competition for strategic knowledge. Göring's new toys, the Luftwaffe's missiles. From 1942 onwards, the Luftwaffe was in clear decline. Allied formations, especially B-17s and B-24s escorted by P-51 Mustangs, were penetrating into the heart of the Reich with increasing impunity. The German air defense was overwhelmed. At a stroke, Hitler and top Luftwaffe commanders were convinced of one thing: they could no longer depend on air superiority. They needed precision weapons, capable of striking without exposing pilots and leaving no room for error. The Kriegswaffe was then looking for radical solutions. Intelligent projectiles that could take advantage of the Reich's technical know-how to compensate for strategic deficiencies. Thus were born two of the first guided weapons in military history: the Fritz X guided bomb and the Ruhrstahl X-4 air-to-air missile. They were conceived as a direct response to a critical situation, a technological army with no room to maneuver. The Fritz X represented the first truly accurate weapon against naval targets. Max Kramer, an aerospace engineer working at the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt and collaborating with Ruhrstahl, took the PC-1400 armor-piercing bomb and attached a radio control system, Kehl Strasberg, to it. In this way, from the bomber, usually a Dornier Do 217K-2, an operator in the cockpit guided the bomb during its descent, maintaining it visually thanks to a flare on the tail and controlling trajectory by joystick while the plane flew straight and level. The launch required a minimum altitude of 4,000 meters and a stable flight that made the bomber an ideal target for anti-aircraft defenses. However, its accuracy proved devastating. It hit the Italian battleship Roma in September 1943, sinking it with hundreds of casualties. Weeks later, it severely damaged the HMS Warspite off Salerno. It was a demonstration of guided firepower. But trouble soon followed. The bombers were exposed to enemy fire all the way while guiding the bomb, and the Allies developed jamming systems that cut off the Kehl Strasberg signal, overriding remote control. The Fritz X was born to be an accurate superweapon, but its use exposed its technical and tactical limitations. Simultaneously, Kramer designed the X-4, an air-to-air missile intended to shoot down bomber formations far from the range of their defenses. It had a hypergolic fuel rocket engine, wire-guided, gyro-stabilized, 20-kilogram warhead with an acoustic Kranich fuse calibrated to detect the characteristic noise of a B-17 as the missile approached. But in practice, guiding the X-4 proved too complex. The pilot had to keep the aircraft on trajectory, control the missile visually by means of fires on its wings, and simultaneously operate the control cables. In tests conducted from FW-190, Ju-88, and even planned for Me-262, it was shown that it was not feasible to launch the X-4 from single-seat fighters. The cognitive and physical load was excessive. Therefore, its use was redirected to twin-engine fighters such as the Ju-88. One pilot who participated in the tests recounted, it was impossible to concentrate on flying the aircraft, targeting the enemy and controlling the missile at the same time. The X-4 seemed alive, but sometimes it would spin out of control and get lost. In addition, Allied bombing raids destroyed the BMW plant where the engines were produced, preventing operational deliveries. Although more than 1,000 units were produced, they never entered operational combat. The development of these weapons was not just a matter of technology, it was the product of a community of engineers, special pilots, and secret units. Kampfgeschwader 100 was the unit designated to operate the Fritz X in combat, while KG 200, a clandestine force created in 1944, had in its possession advanced projects such as the X-4, Mistell aircraft, suicide prototypes, and special missions. KG 200 pilots were chosen for their loyalty and extreme experience, with intensive training and high-risk assignments. One KG 200 veteran commented years later, "We were introduced as the secret squadron that was to test the weapons of the future. We were trained in flight, wire-guided, and remote control. I remember the first test flight with an X-4 left me dizzy. I had to follow two lights in the air while flying my plane and aiming at a moving target." Others recounted minor accidents, missiles going off trajectory, misfires, explosions on launch, or premature cable disengagement. Although without serious fatalities, such tests were risky and emotionally hard. One Fritz X operator recalled a flight in which the Do-217 lost control as soon as he released the bomb. The weight suddenly changed, the plane pitched, and I could barely stabilize it. When I looked at the projectile, it had disappeared into the sea. That taught me that the margin for error was minimal. The projectile's control surfaces were slow to respond, and any sharp turn of the aircraft affected the operator's optical guidance, breaking the line of sight necessary for control. In combat conditions, this made every launch a gamble. These testimonials reflect the high human toll behind the designs. The mental burden was grueling. Many of the pilots involved had fought on the Eastern Front or on night missions over England, and yet they confessed that trials with these weapons caused them more anxiety than traditional aerial combat. The constant fear of technical failure, the pressure of operating with still experimental technology, and the knowledge that they were risking their lives for an unproven missile left deep scars. The integration of these weapons into the Luftwaffe represented a desperate attempt to regain the air initiative. The Fritz X demonstrated that it was possible to sink a battleship with a guided bomb from a safe altitude without the need for entire squadrons or suicide attacks. All it took was a single, well-trained aircraft, a clear line of sight, and a few seconds of maximum concentration. The X-4 represented the next logical step, allowing a single plane to attack an entire bomber formation without entering its defense zone, launching the missile from miles away, out of range of rear gunners and escorts. They were conceptually superweapons, designed to multiply firepower without multiplying manpower, an increasingly urgent need as the Luftwaffe bled on all fronts. Their implementation depended on German ingenuity, precision in industrial production, and the work of elite units such as KG 100 and KG 200. It was not just a matter of technology, but of will and training. Hitler and Goering's direct support for these developments, their inclusion in the Wunderwaffen program, legitimized their funding even as other more immediate projects were sidelined. The obsession with the miracle weapons, with that one stroke of effect that would reverse the course of the war, drove their designers and test pilots to press ahead despite initial failures. The concept, the vision, the what if, was prioritized over immediate technical feasibility. As the war drew to a close, Fritz X and X-4 testing became more chaotic. Spares were lacking, fuel was rationed, and training was conducted with unloaded wooden missiles when they could be flown. The front was closing in on the factories, and many program operators were mobilized as infantry or assigned to Volkssturm battalions. Nevertheless, some pilots still maintained the illusion that if the X-4 worked, they could shoot down entire Allied bomber squadrons without casualties. It was a technical and strategic fantasy, but desperation made it tangible. The Comet, the lethal acid-fueled fighters. From early 1944, faced with the relentless onslaught of Allied bombing raids, the Luftwaffe embarked on a desperate initiative to develop an interceptor capable of instantly climbing and attacking Allied formations before they reached strategic targets. The result was the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, the only operationally employed rocket-powered fighter, and the creation of the specialized Jagdgeschwader 400 JG 400 unit charged exclusively with operating these machines. The Me 163 was powered by a Walter HWK 109-509A engine, which allowed it to reach speeds in excess of 960 kilometers per hour and climb to altitudes of 12,000 meters in just 3 minutes. This speed gave it the ability to disrupt bomber formations such as B-17s from strategic points. However, its fuel was hypergolic and extremely dangerous. Its handling caused multiple explosions, serious injuries and fatalities among pilots and ground personnel. JG-400 was formed on February 1, 1944, under the command of Major Wolfgang Späth, as the only operational group equipped with the Comet. In July that year, the first Me 163BSs were declared operational, and the unit was initially deployed in Venlo, Netherlands, and then in Brandis, near Leipzig. Its main function was to defend key refineries such as Luna and Merseburg. The first real combat took place on August 16, 1944, when 7 Me 163s of JG-400 intercepted a formation of B-17 bombers. Despite their speed, limited fuel range, and a short window of time to fire reduced their effectiveness. In those early encounters, Lieutenant Hartmut Rill was shot down by P-51 escort fighters after making a strike. But 2 days later, in an engagement on August 24th, W. Siegfried Schubert shot down 2 B-17s, and his wingman one more, thus winning the Comet's first confirmed victories. Despite initial enthusiasm, losses were overwhelming. By September, with only 11 operational Comet and fuel shortages due to Allied bombing raids on propellant factories, JG-400 suffered numerous casualties, many from accidents during takeoff or landing. In all, it recorded 9 shoot-downs of Allied aircraft but lost 14 aircraft, most in incidents unrelated to aerial combat. Field trials proved that the Comet was a challenge even for veteran pilots. The takeoff system required a dolly that was released before engine ignition, and landing was on a bottom skid. This solution resulted in frequent cowlings, spinal injuries, and explosions on contact with residual fuel. The hypergolic and highly corrosive propellant flooded the cabin in some failed landings, generating instant toxic effects or flash fires. JG-400 developed specific tactics adapted to the Comet. Pilots would climb rapidly above enemy bombers, dive down through them and fire short bursts from 2 30mm Mk108 guns before gliding back. Some late experiments used an automated SG-500 Jagdfaust system which fired guns upwards when a bomber passed overhead, activated by a photocell. It worked once, shooting down an RAF Halifax, but arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. JG-400 pilots recalled the flights with a mixture of admiration and horror. One testimony described an episode in which the Comet crashed on landing and exploded on impact with the runway, with almost no time to evacuate. Another novice pilot recounted how during the automatic takeoff, the trolley release system failed and he had to fly the aircraft without wheels, with fuel leaking into the cockpit, miraculously managing to land without exploding. Field personnel were also at serious risk. Many operators wore special suits resistant to toxic fluids, but still suffered burns, gas inhalation, and long-term damage. The death of pilot Josef Pols was one of the most famous. Only his goggles and antacid suit were found after the explosion of his Comet. Functional flights were extremely short. Only 5 to 8 minutes of engine running were possible. After that, the plane became a glider and was easy prey for Allied fighters if it was still over hostile territory. As the Reich disintegrated, the lack of fuel and trained pilots became critical. JG-400 barely managed to operate 5 days in a full month at various periods, and low technical availability drastically reduced its operational impact to the demise of the unit due to countless losses. Nuclear bombs in New York. Hail, the German army was retreating on all fronts and cities were being reduced to rubble under Allied bombing. Projects that oscillated between technical audacity and strategic desperation emerged. One of them was the Amerika Bomber, a program conceived to build a long-range aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic, attacking the heart of the United States, mainly New York, and returning to Europe. This initiative, while ambitious, only made sense in conjunction with another unfinished promise of the regime, the development of a nuclear weapon. The German atomic bomb, which never materialized, was to be the ideal payload for that intercontinental bomber. From this fusion of desires, the impossible flight and the non-existent bomb, one of the most emblematic projects of Nazi technological delirium was born. The idea of the Amerika Bomber did not come out of nowhere. As early as 1938, some German planners were studying the possibility of extending the range of their bombers beyond Europe. As the war intensified, the German High Command realized that the United States was not only a key logistical supplier to Britain and the Soviet Union, but that sooner or later it would become their direct enemy. The bombing of Pearl Harbor and the American entry into the war accelerated plans to strike the American continent, both for propaganda reasons and for the illusion of being able to change the course of the conflict. In this context, the Amerika Bomber appeared as a technically viable and politically redeeming proposal. Several aerospace companies presented projects to respond to this requirement. Messerschmitt proposed the Me-2-64, a 4-engine long-range aircraft. Heinkel offered the He-2-77, an evolution of the He-177 that sought to correct its structural and overheating problems. But perhaps the most promising was the Junkers Ju-390, a derivative of the Ju-290, originally conceived as a transport and maritime patrol aircraft, but adapted to reach intercontinental targets. With a wingspan of over 50 meters and 6 BMW 801 engines, the Ju-390 was tested in 1943 and 1944. Later reports of one of these prototypes actually overflew the Atlantic and spotted the east coast of the United States before returning. But this was never officially confirmed. If true, it would have been a remarkable technical achievement, though of no real operational consequence. In parallel with the development of these aircraft, the Nazi regime harbored increasingly unfounded hopes of developing an atomic weapon. The German nuclear program, known as the Uranverein or Uranium Club, had begun early in 1939, even before its US counterpart. However, the German project, despite notable scientists such as Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, never reached a degree of maturity comparable to the Manhattan Project. Fragmentation of the scientific effort, lack of resources, conceptual errors, and interference from the political apparatus conspired against its chances of success. Heisenberg, for example, never succeeded in designing a functional nuclear reactor or building a viable bomb. The group worked primarily with natural uranium reactors moderated with heavy water, but access to this resource was cut off after the destruction of the Norsk hydro plant in Norway by Allied commandos. This was compounded by an underestimation of the uranium enrichment needed for a bomb, which diverted efforts to ineffective models. In sum, although Hitler and his top commanders occasionally spoke of the possibility of having an atomic miracle weapon, their own institutions were nowhere near developing one. Nevertheless, the conceptual connection between the Amerika Bomber and the atomic bomb was kept alive in certain circles of power. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, recounted in his memoirs how Hermann Göring spoke of dropping a solar bomb on New York, an expression that denotes both his technical ignorance and his anxiety to find a radical solution that would reverse the military catastrophe. Some Luftwaffe documents even contemplated the need for a bomber that could carry a load of several tons over distances of up to 12,000 kilometers, precisely the size of a hypothetical German atomic bomb. By the end of 1944, the actual status of both programs was critical. The Amerika Bomber was still at the prototype stage. Test flights were few and far between. Only 2 examples of the Ju 390 were built, and the project was cancelled in early 1945 in the face of the imminent collapse of the Reich. For its part, the Uranverein languished amid incomplete reactors and erratic measurements. On August 6, 1945, when the United States dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the German physicists held in Farm Hall, a house guarded by British intelligence, were stunned. Otto Hahn could not hold back tears, and Heisenberg, in shock and chagrin, acknowledged that they never imagined the Americans would go so far. In the days that followed, some expressed pride that they had not collaborated with such a devastating weapon, while others implied that they simply did not know how to do it. The gap between the Nazi dream of an atomic attack and the reality of its capabilities was thus brutally exposed. The Amerika Bomber and the Uranverein shared not only a strategic convergence but also a common destiny. Both represented the regime's faith in absolute technological solutions, the famous Wunderwaffen or miracle weapons that would save the Reich when all else failed. But neither scientific talent, nor aerodynamic advances, nor Hitler's obsession were enough to compensate for the structural limitations of an exhausted war economy and a chaotic decision-making system. And yet the myth survived. In the post-war period, the idea that the Nazis were about to drop an atomic bomb on the United States was recycled in novels, movies, documentaries, and conspiracy theories. The Ju 390 was turned into a kind of ghost ship, and Heisenberg into the sage who chose the ethical path. These narratives helped to cement the Cold War atomic scare and exaggerate the reach of Nazi science. The real legacy of the Amerika Bomber and the Uranverein was another. They showed that blind faith in technique, when detached from strategic and ethical rationality, can lead not to victory, but to disaster. They were promises of apocalypse that died unfulfilled in shut-down laboratories and bombed hangars when nobody believed in the Führer's miracles anymore. The Luftwaffe of Tomorrow, Adolf Galland's JVE-44. In the bleak months of late 1944 and early 1945, the Jagdverband 44, J544, the special unit that would operate the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262, emerged. Its purpose was not to produce a decisive victory, the war was already lost, but to validate the potential of the first operational jet fighter as a weapon of superiority against the bombers that were devastating Germany. The genesis of the J544 was deeply political. Adolf Galland, until then Luftwaffe fighter pilot general, had been an outspoken critic of the tactics and leadership of Hermann Göring and the High Command. He was relieved of his post after the episode known as the Fighter Pilot Rebellion. But Hitler, aware of the veteran ace's prestige, entrusted him with a new mission: to form an elite unit equipped with the Me-262 in order to demonstrate that the hyper-future of German aviation was not a fantasy. With this, Galland symbolically obtained a unit of his own and bureaucratically dissident from any superior structure. Thus was born the Jagdverband 44, an autonomous squadron made up exclusively of elite pilots, many of them with more than 100 confirmed shoot-downs and holders of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. It was jokingly said that having earned this decoration was practically the unofficial requirement to join his staff. Among them were Walter Krupinski, Gerhard Barkhorn, Günther Lützow, Johannes Steinhoff, and later Heinrich Baer, all of whom became the reference points for the myth of the jet experts. The unit was officially established in February-March 1945 and received a minimum strength of Me-262s, never more than a dozen operational at a time. Its main base was first at Brandenburg-Brest, then moved to Munich-Riem and later to Salzburg-Maxglan as the front was getting dangerously close. Its mission was simple but dramatic: to intercept Allied bomber squadrons annihilating German cities and industrial centers, flying at speeds in excess of 900 kilometers per hour and armed with 4 30mm Mk-108 guns, along with R-4M air-to-air rockets. The Me-262 had been designed since the late 1930s, with prototypes developed as early as 1941. It was cleanly ahead of any Allied aircraft in speed, but was late in delivering reliable engines. Only around April-May 1944 did deliveries begin, but Hitler insisted that the aircraft be used primarily in ground attacks, reducing its impact as an airborne interceptor. This generated an internal crisis. Galland demanded that they be used as fighters, which he finally achieved by creating JV-44. Training was intensive and accelerated. Pilots had to get used to speeds never handled before, minimum reaction times and complex procedures. Takeoff with dolly released in the air, limited fuel supply and vulnerable systems in emergencies. In addition, takeoff and landing were the most dangerous moments. The Mi-262 was slow at low speed, and its engine reacted badly to sudden changes, which made it a target for Allied fighters. To protect this critical phase, Galland created a specialized escort squadron, Platzschutzstaffel, consisting of brightly painted Focke-Wulf 19D9s, Papagei Staffel, to avoid friendly anti-aircraft fire. These escorts would take off first, clear the airspace, and then allow the Mi-262s to take off without interference. JV-44 flew its first full combat mission on April 5, 1945, led by Captain Klaus Neumann from Munich-Riem. The group intercepted formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers. Neumann shot down 3, and the squadron won 5 victories that day. It was a withering demonstration of the aircraft's potential, but also of the chaos. Changing weather conditions, fuel shortages, and the mobile dispersion of their bases made deployments difficult. Over the next week, JV-44 pilots achieved numerous shootdowns, especially Marauder, Liberator, and B-17 type bombers. Galland recorded several victories, including from his hospital when he was wounded on April 26 while engaging fighters protecting A-20 bombers. He was relieved by Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Baer, a staunch expert with more than 200 total victories, who assumed command at full operational activity. Baer commanded almost to the end. On April 27th, he went on a combat mission together with other pilots and achieved another victory with the prototype Mi-262A1/U5, equipped with 6 guns in the nose. A day later, on April 28th, it achieved another 4 shootdowns, bringing its tally to 16 in jet alone. La unidad totalizó unos 24 derribos confirmados en apenas 2 meses, consumiendo vetas de combustible escasas y enfrentando diariamente el avance aliado. JV-44 pilots described their flights as a mixture of instant glory and permanent tension. Flying at breakneck speeds, facing enemy fighters or armored bombers with 30mm bursts or guided rockets meant maximum concentration within seconds. The fragmented organization of the RLM, delays in spare parts, lack of trained pilots, and constant pressure meant that accidental losses were frequent on the ground. By May 3, 1945, the evacuation order came: relocate JV-44 to Prague and rename it IV/JG7. However, most of its members chose to surrender to the Western Allies rather than be trapped by the Red Army. Galland led much of the personal surrender under General Eisenhower's command. Shortly thereafter, the pilots, largely leading experts, participated in Operation Lusty, which enabled the United States to capture several Mi-262s intact. Eventually, several aircraft were set on fire by their own pilots to prevent their capture. The last one standing agreed to surrender in Austria in the first days of May. The unit physically disappeared, although it left an unforgettable legacy. It had demonstrated with few machines and in desperate conditions the value of an aircraft that advanced the future of combat aviation by decades. From a historical point of view, JV-44 represents Germany's last attempt to challenge Allied air superiority with advanced technology and elite personnel. The Mi-262, for its part, became a symbol of what could have been more than 1,000 built, but only about 200 to 250 fighters available, with limited range and vulnerable takeoffs and landings. Even so, its performance far surpassed any Allied fighter, faster, heavier in armament, and, in the hands of pilots like those of JV-44, deadly effective. Some later accounts described the experience as addictive but exhausting. You were flying a fast-paced piece of destiny, knowing that every sortie could be your last, one pilot later wrote. Others recalled the intense camaraderie. Amid demoralized pilots, JV-44 was an oasis where there was still talk of combat techniques, of precision, of the art of flight. There were also accidents in tests and training flights due to engine errors or wrong maneuvering, but those crashes were counted as consequences of operating an advanced concept without a logistical base. In short, the Me-2, 6-2 and JV-44 embodied the ultimate Luftwaffe card, an elite unit made up of veteran aces equipped with the most advanced fighter of its time, deployed with little logistics, little fuel, and in improvised bases. With modest strategic objectives to intercept bombers over German territory, and a symbolic mandate to demonstrate Nazi technological superiority. Although its achievements float like a heroic gleam in the Reich's final night, they also highlight its tragic condition, a highly advanced machine used when there was no more war to win and no more unit to save. The Mistell, the composite aircraft. The Luftwaffe desperately explored unconventional weapons concepts that could reverse the course of the war. One of the most daring and peculiar developments was the Mistell program, a series of composite bombers in which a piloted fighter bomber was mounted on an unmanned bomber packed with explosives. The concept, born out of a strictly German logic of maximizing resources, combining technical innovation and compensating for Allied superiority in the air, became one of the strangest yet most reckless weapons of the conflict. The word Mistell means mistletoe, a plant that grows as a parasite on others, an ironically appropriate name for these tandem assemblies. The system consisted of a Junkers Ju-88 bomber modified to become a giant flying bomb with more than 3 tons of explosive rigidly attached to a Focke-Wulf FW-190 or Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter that served as a guidance module. The pilot, seated in the upper fighter, would guide the assembly to the target, release the Ju-88 when over the target, and then turn to escape while the lower aircraft tracked ballistically or with autopilot assistance toward detonation. The genesis of the Mistell was not the product of centralized planning, but of individual initiatives within the Luftwaffe. The concept was initially promoted by Oberstleutnant Siegfried Holzbauer of E. Stelle Rechlin, Germany's most important flight test center. In 1943, formal development of the project was authorized and experimental trials began at Peenemünde, with support from Junkers engineers and technical staff of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. Before long, enthusiasm for the project spread to include Hitler, who considered it part of his Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapons that were to save Germany from collapse. The first operational design was the Mistell one, which combined a modified Ju-88A4 with a Focke-Wulf 190A4 or A8. Inside the Ju-88, the entire payload and cockpit were replaced with a high explosive known as Trialen 105, a mixture of TNT, hexagen, and aluminum capable of piercing even the thickest concrete walls. The bomber's nose was modified with a hollow impact fuse inspired by anti-tank-shaped charges. This warhead was specially designed to destroy bunkers, dams, or battleships by penetrating the target before detonating. To guide these devices to the target, the pilot used a special sight designed by Carl Zeiss and followed a carefully planned trajectory. The attacks were carried out at night or at high altitude to avoid Allied radars. Once the Ju-88 was released, the explosion was devastating. However, getting to the target was a complex feat. The Mistel sets were slow, heavy, and difficult to maneuver, making them easy targets if detected. Pilot training was demanding. Initially, veterans with experience flying in extreme conditions were selected. The coordination between the navigation of the combined apparatus, the exact moment of detachment, and the subsequent escape required coolness, technique, and nerves of steel. Special units were formed within the Luftwaffe. such as Versuchskommando 6 and later Kampfgeschwader 101 and 200, to operate with the Mistells. One of the most representative squadrons was the 4th Wing of the 200 Bomber Group, specialized in high-risk missions, sabotage and covert operations. Primary Mistell targets included the port of Gibraltar, the Allied fleet in the Mediterranean, the port of Leningrad, Soviet industrial installations, and later the bridges over the Oder and Neisse. One of the most ambitious attacks was Operation Eisenhammer, which envisaged a massive offensive against the Moscow and Gorky power plants to disable the Soviet industrial network. However, the offensive was never executed due to the collapse of the Eastern Front and irresolvable logistical problems. Beginning in 1944, the Mistell began to be used in actual combat. In Normandy, after D-Day, several missions were organized against Allied naval concentrations and strategic bridges. The outcome of these missions was mixed and often disappointing. Some achieved success, such as the attack on the Tannay towing bridge at Cherbourg, which was severely damaged, or an operation on a group of landing ships off Courseulles-sur-Mer that resulted in the confirmed loss of at least one Allied ship. In these cases, the Mistells managed to penetrate radar coverage and anti-aircraft systems thanks to low-altitude flights, attacking in foggy conditions or at unexpected times. However, these achievements were exceptional. In many other missions, the Mistells were detected and attacked by Allied fighters before reaching the target. Mustang and Tempest fighters, patrolling the French airspace almost unopposed after the annihilation of much of the Luftwaffe in Reich skies, intercepted the Mistells even when flying evasive trajectories. The poor maneuverability of the whole and the vulnerability of the Ju-88 loaded with explosives made it an easy target once separated from the superior fighter, which had to evade at full speed to avoid being hit by enemy fire or by the explosion of its own bomb. In addition, technical failures were frequent. Pilots reported multiple incidents where the detachment system failed partially or completely, forcing mission aborts or even emergency landings with the aircraft still assembled. Other pilots described how, after separation, the Ju-88 would descend erratically, drifting away from the target due to wind gusts, loss of stability, or miscalculations at the time of launch. One of the best-known testimonies comes from Lieutenant Joachim Kirchner, who recounted that during a night attack on a railroad target near Caen, his Mistell drifted several hundred meters when caught in an updraft. Although the explosive detonated on impact with the ground, the primary target was undamaged. Kirchner also recalled the momentary disorientation after separation, when the fighter shook violently and required several seconds to stabilize, a critical time in areas with heavy enemy presence. Another similar case was recounted by Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Worder, who described how his Mistell was hit by anti-aircraft fire before reaching the target. Although he managed to free the Ju-88, the aircraft was already on fire and exploded prematurely without causing any damage. Worder narrowly escaped, being pursued by Allied fighters until he found cover in a wooded area. "We weren't kamikazes," he said years later, but we knew our chances of getting back were minimal. The Mistel was powerful but slow, clumsy, and every mission was like playing Russian roulette with the sky. A pilot who took part in one of the operations over the English Channel recounted years later, "The cockpit of the FW-190 was shaking with every movement of the Ju-88. At 3,000 meters, I dropped the bomb. I had time to see it spiral down, but I didn't see the explosion. The fog covered everything." Another 4th/KG-200 testimony recounted the anguish prior to takeoff. "We knew the success rate was low, but we also knew that one hit could change the course of a battle. The problem was that we didn't know if we were going to have time to get back or if the Mistel was going to release properly." Despite the obstacles, the concept continued to evolve. New variants were designed, such as the Mistell II with a Ju-88G1 and the Mistell III, which included more modern aircraft such as the Focke-Wulf 190F8 and even more powerful explosives. Versions with Me-262 jet fighters were also planned, although they failed to materialize due to coupling and stability problems at high speed. In the last months of the war, the use of Mistell became more desperate. Faced with the Soviet advance, squadrons were withdrawn into the German hinterland and used to attack strategic bridges and tank clusters. One of the most repeated targets was the Küstrin Bridge over the Oder, the destruction of which could have delayed the Red Army's offensive towards Berlin. However, most of the attempts proved unsuccessful or too late. Beyond its limited operational success, the Mistell represents a unique moment in the history of military aviation. It was a hybrid solution between the guided missile, the suicide aircraft, and the contemporary drone. Its use, more tactical than strategic, reflected both the Reich's technological desperation and its ability to devise advanced concepts with meager means. The Allies, upon capturing some Mistells intact, were perplexed by the audacity of the design. In many ways, the Mistell was a precursor to later technologies such as glide bombs, pilot-guided air-to-surface missiles, and coordinated attacks with autonomous weapons. Although the project was eventually overtaken by military reality and Allied advances, it left a unique imprint on the war imagination of the 20th century. Hitler's spoiled children, the Gustav and Dora railway guns. The most colossal cannon ever built by mankind was born out of Hitler's obsession with breaking the defensive will of his enemies. In the late 1930s, as Europe was arming itself for a war that seemed inevitable, the Führer commissioned the Krupp Company to design a weapon capable of destroying the fortifications of the French Maginot Line. What was to be an instrument of siege became an enormous symbol of industrial power, an 80-centimeter caliber railway gun capable of launching projectiles the size of a small automobile almost 50 kilometers away. Its construction was a technical feat and a logistical folly. The gun was named Schwerer Gustav in honor of Gustav Krupp, and years later a second unit called Dora was manufactured. Both pieces were more than 47 meters long, with a 32-meter gun and a total weight exceeding 1,350 tons. It was not possible to mount it on a single track. 2 parallel lines and 80 wheels distributed on 8 double bogies were required. To point it horizontally, the entire monster needed to be moved on a specially constructed curved track, while the tube elevation was up to 65 degrees. The assembly alone required 3 weeks of intensive work by more than 4,000 operators, engineers and specialized soldiers, plus the laying of tracks, cranes, shelters, ammunition depots and anti-aircraft protection. The projectiles were as colossal as the weapon itself. 2 types were produced: a 4.8-ton high explosive with a 700-kilogram TNT charge and a 7.1-ton armor-piercing 1, capable of penetrating up to 7 meters of reinforced concrete or 1 meter of armored steel. The exit velocity was around 800 meters per second. To load it, special cranes were used to lift each projectile into the chamber, and the rate of fire did not exceed 14 rounds per day. Each shot took between 30 and 45 minutes to set up. The only time Gustav was used in actual combat was during the siege of Sevastopol in the Crimea in June 1942. There, from a fortified position in Bakhchisare, 16 kilometers from the front, he fired on Soviet fortifications that were believed to be impregnable. The targets were specific: coastal batteries, armored forts, and subway tanks. One of the shells pierced more than 30 meters of earth and concrete to destroy an ammunition depot dug into the rock, causing a massive explosion. In total, Gustav fired 48 shells during that campaign. At the end of the operation, the gun tube was worn out and needed replacement. It never returned to combat. Dora, the second unit, was sent to the Eastern Front in the fall of 1942 with the intention of being used at Stalingrad. But the rapidity of the Soviet advance forced its withdrawal before it could fire. Thereafter, its role was relegated to possible plans that never materialized. In the last months of the war, with the imminent fall of the Reich, both pieces were destroyed by the Germans themselves to avoid capture. Behind its imposing metallic figure, an absurd reality was hidden. Each piece required a train of 25 cars and a special railway line of almost 1.5 kilometers. The operating conditions demanded an organization that included thousands of soldiers, Krupp technicians, engineer units, specialized artillerymen, and complete anti-aircraft batteries. German conventional artillery could launch thousands of shells in the same time the Gustav fired a single round. The human and logistical cost to operate this marvel was disproportionate to its practical results. Despite its poor military effectiveness, Schwerer Gustav became an emblem. It represented the German belief that technology could solve strategic problems. It was the material expression of Nazi megalomania, a gigantic machine created more for the spectacle of power than to change the course of a war. Hitler visited it personally on several occasions, fascinated by its titanic presence. Reich propagandists portrayed it as the cannon of the end of the world, while the officers who operated it knew it was nothing more than a relic of an obsolete conception of warfare where size mattered more than effectiveness. In the field, the soldiers watched in amazement at its assembly. Some German pilots recalled how, from the air, the semicircle of curved tracks that allowed the Gustav to adjust the angle of fire could be distinguished. From overhead, it looked like a mobile factory, a titan on rails that needed its own ecosystem to function. An artillery NCO who operated it at Sevastopol wrote that the detonation shook the ground for several seconds and that the first shots caused more commotion among his own troops than among the enemy. A Krupp engineer acknowledged years later that the Gustav was a miscalculation, an industrial answer to a problem that aviation and rocket artillery were already beginning to solve in other ways. The Soviets found its wreckage in 1945 near Auerbach, dismantled, destroyed, and partially dynamited. They took photos, measured the parts, and recorded the size and complexity of a machine they never got to face directly. In France, after the war, fragments of Dora were also found abandoned in a forest. No one claimed these steel skeletons. They had been built for a war that no longer existed. Today, none of these pieces remain intact. Only photographs, memories, scrapped parts, and models survive. The Gustav was not a decisive weapon. It was a statement of intent. Nazi Germany was willing to build the impossible, even if it made no practical sense. And in that paradox, its legacy is summed up. A technical prodigy that served more to show the collapse of a worldview than to change the outcome of a battle. A mass that fired few shots never changed the course of a war, but continues to fascinate for what it represented: ambition without limit, power without direction, and engineering at the service of delirium.